in the West. Very interestingly, he spoke about how ghazal as a form of poetry was all about the men poets who wrote explicitly homosexual or homoerotic poetry, and mentioned the Rekhti poetry, a form of Urdu poetry, wherein a male poet assumed the persona of a woman and wrote poetry addressed to a woman. Sufi poetry and Bhakti poetry could also be seen as similar examples, he said. While answering a question, Dr. Rao said that we are still reluctant to include queer studies as a part of syllabus, and queer studies is often grouped with gender studies, but the focus there is gender, usually the female. And so now there is a need to delink sexuality from gender studies and give its rightful place in the syllabus. He further went on to talk about the homophobia that was prevalent in the early 20th century Europe and gave example of Germany under the Nazi rule, wherein many gay people were persecuted along with the Jews because what Hitler and others thought was that if men sleep with men, how will they produce children and thereby soldiers to fight the war? He then talked about how surveillance mechanism, the state surveillance mechanism, leads to hounding and brutality by the police. He also cited the example of Stonewall riot in 1969 in New York, which marks the beginning of the gay liberation movement, and how today, 26 June, is celebrated worldwide as Gay Pride Day. He spoke about the gay movement in India beginning from the 1990s with the establishment of Humsafar Trust, and said that we still have a very long way to go. That's it. Thank you.
Dipti,
Hello.
thank you very much for a very vivid summary of the previous session. I'm sure those of us who have joined today and they missed actually the previous session have some idea as to what kind of discussion we had in the past. Dipti, once again, thank you very much. Those of you who are interested in reading more on, feminist reading, please do visit Dipti Muzumdar's blog. She writes amazingly, scholarly articles. So do visit and do comment on her writings. Dipti, once again, thank you. Now I request Dr. R. Raj Rao to take the charge of this session and continue his discussion on queer theory, literature, and cinema. Dr. Raj.
Hi. Today I'm going to talk on queer literature and cinema. Now, because the field here is very vast, I'm going to restrict myself to India. I can't talk about the world, can't certainly include the West in this because there's a lot of production within India. And also, I'm going to restrict myself mainly to the 20th and 21st centuries and mostly to writing that is in English. Um, so these are some of the parameters within which I'm going to be speaking about queer literature and then move on to cinema. Let me start by saying, Dipti mentioned surveillance mechanisms, and let me start by saying that to my mind, it's extremely ironic that most of this work, this body of work, was produced in the backdrop of India's infamous anti-gay law. And I do think that it's ironic because although the wording of Section 377 speaks of unnatural sexual activity, but literature and film that depict such activity can always be um, it can be held culpable for inciting people to to indulge in unnatural sexual activity. So if that didn't happen, I think it's quite miraculous. I wouldn't say that it didn't happen because the government and the judiciary are progressive or anything like that. It's just that, well, cases were not filed, but if they were, I think that many of us could have been booked under the law. Also, because I think I talked briefly about, or did I, or I can't remember whether I spoke about queer aesthetics. I think I may not have, because that is really a part of literature and cinema, that every literature, and particularly every marginal literature, has its own aesthetics. And this began with post-colonial literature that also had its own aesthetics. For example, Helen Tiffin speaks of post-colonial literature as deploying what she calls counter-discursive strategies. Now, that is part of its aesthetics. And the same is true of Dalit literature, you know, which the upper caste Savarna critics have a problem with because they don't understand the aesthetics of Dalit literature. Women's literature too has its own aesthetics, and likewise, queer literature does have its own aesthetics. It can't replicate the aesthetics of mainstream literature. It may do that up to a point, but aesthetics come into play when you are interpreting marginal literature, because if you don't have an autonomous set of critical principles by which to evaluate, and you use mainstream critical theories to read gay literature, you will do injustice to it because it will not measure up to your standards. You know, let me give you another example. A famous example um, of how women's writing has argued for its own aesthetics. Now, if you take canonical literature, T.S. Eliot's famous dictum that poetry is not a turning loose of emotion but an escape from it does not apply to a lot of women's writing, and indeed to Dalit writing and gay writing, because if anything, it's got a surfeit of emotion. It's not escaping from emotion. And then, so if you use that principle of T.S. Eliot, which is expounded in his famous essay Tradition and the Individual Talent, then you would say that, well, gay writing and women's writing and so on doesn't measure up. And therefore, Eliot's principle must be jettisoned, thrown out of the window, and women's writing, gay writing, Dalit writing, and other marginal literatures, black writing, would have to evolve its own set of critical principles on the basis of which you read it and interpret it and evaluate it. So that is important, to keep in mind. Now, one of the aesthetic principles of queer literature, and obviously this is not the only one, it has certain other things which are, which it shares with both women's writing and Dalit writing, and that is that it tends to be autobiographical. And the reason marginal literatures tend to be autobiographical is not hard to see. Marginal literatures tend to be autobiographical because the lives of the people who create these marginal literatures, who are from within that marginal category, they are insiders, not outsiders. Outsiders cannot write about marginal people. I think that ended with untouchable Mulk Raj Anand's 1935 novel. But today, a Kshatriya like Mulk Raj Anand will not dare to write about untouchable people. It will have to be done by people from within the category, and that is because people from within the category have educated themselves, empowered themselves, they've learned how to write, and they can tell their own stories. So they don't need others to tell their stories on their behalf. Now, gay writing, along with other forms of marginal writing, whether it's black or Dalit or women's writing, does, of course, heavily bank on autobiography. And as I said, the reason is that our lives are so dramatic that we don't have to look elsewhere. You know, if you're completely empowered, there's no drama left in your life, and that is when you have to invent situations. The dead white heterosexual European male has no conflict left in his life because drama, art is based on conflict and tension, and there's no drama left in his life, and therefore he has to invent. But we are not in that situation, thankfully, I would say. And so, there's a lot of conflict and drama in our own lives, and therefore we don't have to look elsewhere. We just sort of um, look at look at the graph of our own lives, and we have our stories. So that's one of the aspects of gay writing, which it shares with other forms of marginal writing, that it tends to be autobiographical. But additionally, it seems to me that a lot of gay LGBT writing, is sexually explicit. Again, the reasons are obvious. Since our constituency is sex, just as that of the Dalits is caste, and that of women is gender, and that of black people is race, the constituency of homosexual people is sex and sexuality, and therefore the writing is bound to foreground that, and there's going to be a good deal of explicit sexuality in the work, whether you like it or not. Now, different writers would, of course, um, deal with it differently. I'm not saying that all LGBT writers will write explicitly sexual writing to the same degree. Different writers will do it differently. Some might veer towards classicism, as say Vikram Seth might uh, intend to do, because he's looking at a mass readership. Others like me couldn't care less, about a mass readership. And actually, a lot of my work is extremely sexually explicit, and some would say even borders on pornography. Now, this is what makes it especially vulnerable to the charge that it, incites people to behavior that is forbidden by the law. So this is the irony, that all of this work was produced in the backdrop of India's notorious anti-sodomy law introduced by the Victorians in 1861. Now, let me, what I'm going to do is give you an inventory of the names of writers. In some cases, I will name their major work. Can't possibly name everything by every one of them, because actually there's quite a large body of work, and I've broadly divided it into two groups: creative writing and critical writing and anthologies. So to start with creative writing, um, we have Ismat Chugtai. Now, she, of course, didn't write in English. She wrote in Urdu. And one of her most famous novels is this novel called Lihaf, which has been translated by Penguin into English. It's called The Quilt in English translation. So I think that LGBT writing in the 20th century, I'm using these terms interchangeably, so don't be confused. LGBT, queer, gay writing, I'm just using them interchangeably, but they all mean the same thing for the purposes of this discussion. So Chuptai's Lihaf is, in a way, at the starting point of LGBT writing in the 20th century. It's a story of these two women who sleep, a woman and her maidservant actually, who are sleeping under the same quilt. And then there's this child who pulls out the quilt and sees both of them. Apparently, there's an injunction in the Quran which says that two people of the same gender mustn't sleep under the same quilt or same blanket. So they were violating that injunction. Um, it is believed that Deepa Mehta's film Fire, about which I will speak a little later, is based on Quilt, on Chughtai's novel. It is loosely, but actually there's another movie that came out a few years ago that is, more faithful to the novel. And this is a film called Ded Ishqiya with Nasiruddin Shah and Madhuri Dixit. And if you get a chance, do see this film Ded Ishqiya, which, more faithfully follows the storyline of the quilt. After Ismat Chugta, incidentally, like Oscar Wilde earlier, she was booked for obscenity and so on, because it was still early days. As I said, all of us escaped, and we were never booked for obscenity, though we could have been, but we weren't. But Ismat Chugtai was. After her comes Suniti Namjoshi, another well-known Indian lesbian writer, who had to leave India actually because of her sexuality and because of her writing. She's very much a Pune girl, the city where I have spent the latter half of my life and taught in Pune University, um, belonging to a upper caste family who lives in one of Pune's most orthodox and conservative neighborhoods, Sadashivpet. And the story is that her family said to her that if you want to be lesbian, you can't stay here. And so she um, had to emigrate to different Western countries, starting with Canada and America, and I think she may be in England now. But she's part of the Indian diaspora, you know. And when I met her several years ago at the Taj, when there was a lit fest, we were all having a few drinks, and she looks at me and says to the others, "This man is brave. He lives in Pune and writes gay literature," meaning that that's something that she couldn't do, and that is why she relocated to the West. Suniti Namjoshi's famous works are, um, she writes poetry as well, but she's more um, known as a fiction writer, more well known as a fiction writer. Feminist Fables is one of her well known works, and the other is a slim novel called Conversations of Cow. So this is Suniti Namjoshi, who is both a lesbian and a feminist. And of course, lesbianism and feminism had much in common. When I was doing Eve Sedgwick, I did not have the opportunity to go into this in a lot of detail. But at one time before 1980, prior to the AIDS pandemic, the view was that feminism is the theory and lesbianism is the practice. So lesbianism is the applied side of feminism for a lot of people, and there is something called lesbian feminism. And as I keep saying, lesbianism is an ism, like feminism and Marxism, whereas male homosexuality is not an ism. You don't say homoism or gayism. After that, I'm going to mention two writers who are famous because they're both part of the literary canon in India, but they are an aberration because whereas with Ismat Chugtai and Suniti Namjoshi, you have very positive representations of homosexuality, because that is the other thing. You might write gay literature, but what is your point of view? Are you are you celebrating it, or are you um, running it down? And of course, with Ismat Chugtai and Suniti Namjoshi, it is a celebration of lesbian sexuality because they were lesbian themselves. But these two writers, whom I'm going to mention next, who are very famous and who are presumably not lesbian and homosexual, are respectively Shobha Dey and Vijay Tendulkar. And both of them have works, a novel in Shobha Dey's case and a play in Tendulkar's case, which deal with a lesbian protagonist. Shobha Dey's novel is called Strange Obsession, in which there is this girl whose name is Minx, and she has what the title calls her strange obsession for another woman, and I think that the title says it all. The title speaks of the author's own homophobia, or at least, if not the author's homophobia, because Shobha Dey has been a friend of the LGBT community, so maybe it's unfair to call it the author's homophobia, but it is certainly the protagonist's homophobia, because the protagonist is the one that Minx is after, and the protagonist tries her best, I mean, to um, stave off her advances till, Minx is, as you would expect, cured of her strange obsession by the time we get to the end of the novel. And then we have the famous Vijay Tendulkar, Marathi playwright, who saw himself as a champion of social causes. But he writes this play in Marathi called Mitrachi Goshta, translated into English as Friend's Story, which is, a similar story where there is a lesbian and um, um, by the time we reach the end of the play, her family has managed to cure her of her lesbianism, which they see as perverse, and get her married. So she's reclaimed. Therefore, for LGBT writing, both Strange Obsession and the Tendulkar play Mitrachi Goshta have done a disservice, because these are 20th century works. By the 20th century, one would have expected a more progressive attitude from both Chogade and Vijay Tendulkar, but unfortunately, that wasn't forthcoming. Now, the other names, of course, I'm going to mention, and you've probably heard most of them. You know, Vikram Seth, who's very well known, and his novel Golden Gate, which is a novel in 600 plus sonnets, um, is certainly got gay characters. Unfortunately, it's not set in India, but it's set in California in the Golden Gate Bridge. So that's one of the criticisms against it, that it's talking about homosexuality, but in an American context and not in an Indian context. But then Vikram Seth also has collections of poems because he's a poet. And, his first collection, The Humble Administrator's Garden, actually has some almost very explicit poems which express longing for a male companionship. Vikram Seth has been, ambivalent about his sexuality. Earlier, he refused to come out of the closet, but then later on he did. And when a petition was being signed, to have Section 377 repealed, he was one of the famous signatories to that petition, along with Amartya Sen. So after that point, coming out of the closet is a one-way process. You can't come out of the closet and go back into it. So we know that Vikram Seth is part of the LGBT community, and but then all his writing is not gay writing, because he aims at a mainstream audience. For example, his uh, novel Suitable Boy is certainly not a gay novel by any stretch. Mahesh Dattani, on the other hand, is also well known. He won the Sahitya Academy Award, but not for any of his gay plays, but for a play called Final Solutions, which was really based on the Bombay riots and the aftermath of the demolition of the Babri Masjid. But his gay plays are famous, especially plays like Dance Like a Man, which deals with trans issues, and Muggy Night in Mumbai, which was also made into a film, and the one-act play Night Queen, which I have often taught in the LGBT class. So that is Mahesh Dattani, who has concentrated on drama. He's not dabbled in other forms like fiction and poetry, but a lot of his plays are very explicitly gay, and they do what I was saying earlier in terms of queer aesthetics. If you read Night Queen, for example, it's got very explicit language. It uses four-letter words. It uses the word fuck and so on. So that is Mahesh Dattani. Hoshang Merchant has been a poet um, who's got, actually a large number of collections of very explicitly gay poetry. Explicit not just in the sexual sense, but also in the romantic sense. Most of these collections were published by the Writers' Workshop, and therefore they're not widely known because the Writers' Workshop doesn't have a very good distribution system. But Hoshang Merchant is known. He lives in Hyderabad and very well known in Hyderabad as well as nationally and even internationally as a gay poet and a professor of English at the Central University of Hyderabad till 2012. And he's also got two critical books, which I will mention when I'm talking about the critical work. There is Firdos Kanga, who has a who's both homosexual and he also writes about disability, again from an autobiographical standpoint, because Firdos Kanga has always been on a wheelchair. And his first novel, very famous, Trying to Grow, was also made into a film by BBC. And the recent film, I'll talk about films later, Margarita with a Straw, likewise deals with, it's not based on his novel, but it deals with a character who's both homosexual and suffers from disability. So that's Firdos Kanga, Parsi, Bombay boy. But then he migrated to England, to London, and he writes both as a homosexual as well as somebody who's been on a wheelchair from birth because he was born with a disability. Um, I'm going to include a Sri Lankan writer, Sham Selvadurai, whose book Funny Boy I mentioned. He's not strictly Indian, but then if we look at it in a South Asian context, of course, Sham Selvadurai work must be included. After Funny Boy, he wrote another novel called Tennis Player. Funny Boy is taught and prescribed in many universities. I don't know how they teach it because it's very explicitly homosexual. What it does is it brings two kinds of politics together. It blends sexual politics of the protagonist. I told you how RG um, is somebody who thinks that he's in the wrong gender, and as early as 6 years of age, he dresses in his mother's saris, is found out. But then, as it turns out, he um, um, realizes that he's homosexual. But the other aspect of Funny Boy is that it's dealing with the ethnic politics of Sri Lanka. So RG is also part of Sri Lanka's Tamil minority, um, and there was of course this famous um, civil war within Sri Lanka, um, where the LTTE fought for the rights of the Tamils. They wanted an independent homeland in the northeast in the province of Jaffna, which of course didn't happen. And a lot of Tamil people had to leave the island. Selvadura is part of Sri Lanka's Tamil minority, and it was at that time that he and his family had to leave the island, and he lives in Toronto in Canada today. And then, lastly, of course, in all humility, I have to mention my own work, which starts with a collection of short stories in 1995. One Day I Locked My Flat in Soul City, which has some very explicitly homosexual short stories, followed by a collection of poems called Bomb Gay, which Riyad Baudia made into a uncensored film the following year in 1996, and couldn't really take that further because 7 years later he died of AIDS in 2003, and therefore that film is not available. A lot of commentary has been written on it. That's the irony. But then, if anybody wants to really access the film, it's very hard to find it. Then in uh, 2003, of course, my most famous novel, um, The Boyfriend, which went into many impressions, translated into European languages. The film rights were sold. Ashim Ahluwalia has been sitting on the film rights for a long time. He wanted to finally make the film this year with international collaboration, but with this curfew, I don't know what's happening. And then I followed that up with other novels, Hostel Room 131 in 2010, Lady Lolita's Lover in 2015, Madam Give Me My Sex last year, which also has a gay professor as a character. uh, not me. So all my work, and of course another collection of short stories, Crocodile Tears, in 2017, which has stories from the first collection and then other stories as well. All my writing, in one way or other, of course, returns to homosexual love. And then the novel which I'm working on, Mahmud and Ayaz, which uses the legendary love story of Sultan Mahmud of Ghazni and his slave lover Ayaz as the backdrop. It's only the backdrop, so it's not a full-fledged historical novel. Also, my other collections of poems in For Hire, um, and the recent national anthem and other poems. So, the creative work that I do cannot not um, return to homosexual love one way or other. Let me move on from creative writing to critical writing. And here the names would be Ruth and Salim, Ruth Vanita and Salim Kidwai, Same Sex Love in India, readings from literature and history. I told you a little bit about um, tumultuous journey of that book where Indian publishers refused to bring it out. They had to go to St. Martin's Press in New York, and then Indian publishers later brought it out. And a lot of the discussion on history the other day was, you know, based on that book. So there's that, and of course there's Devdutt Patnaik's various books. His most famous is Shikandini, which deals with the um, story of Shikandini, who has a female to male sex change operation. So that's part of the mythology. Ruth Vanita has other books as well. She has a book called Queering India. I've got it right here. This is a collection of essays, to which I will come back in a little while. And the subtitle is Same Sex Love and Eroticism in Indian Culture and Society. She also has a book called Same Sex Marriage in India and the West. Very interesting. Um, Hoshang Merchant is also a critic because he was a professor. He has, a famous critical work published by Routledge called Forbidden, very interesting title actually, Forbidden Sex, Forbidden Text, New India's Gay Poets. So that's a critical study. And then his recent Gay Icons of India, where he's profiling 22 out famous gay men and women in India. There's another book called Because I Have a Voice, edited by Gautam Ban and Arvind Narayan, which is a collection of essays. Again, that's an edited volume. There's Parmesh Shahani's Gay Bombay, which is actually his PhD thesis submitted to MIT Boston, and then that was published as a book. Um, that specifically it looks up close at this support group in Bombay called Gay Bombay, which I think I told you was a breakaway group from the Humsafar Trust, founded by people like Bikram Doctor and so on. Um, there are some foreigners too who have written about um, same-sex love and culture in India. There's Oliver Ross's famous book, which has a title similar to that of Ruth Vanita, Same-sex desire in Indian culture. This is a British scholar, Oliver Ross. There's an Australian Chinese writer, Benjamin Law, who has this book called Dacia. It's really a portmanteau word, gay and Asia, and he combines it and writes his book, Geisha. There's Andrew Grossman, who has a book called Queer Asian Cinema, Shadows and the Shade, which has essays on cinema, queer cinema from different parts of Asia, and there's a whole section on India. And in my case, I would cite two books, Whistling in the Dark, 21 Queer Interviews, which I co-edited with Divya Jyoti Sharma, and the recent Criminal Love, Queer Theory, Culture and Politics in India. Both were published by Sage. And Parmesh Shani's book was also published by Sage. Hoshang Merchants was by Routledge, and Parmesh Shani, yeah, Gautam Ban and Arvind Narayan, that was by Yoda Press. So, some of these presses have also sort of specialized in bringing out gay writing and gay critical work. There are anthologies as well, you know, collections of writing. And once again, I must mention Hoshang Merchant's name because in 1999 he brought out the first anthology of gay writing from India called Yarana, Gay Writing from India. About 10 years later, it was reissued and with a little more work included and called Yarana, Gay Writing from South Asia. The same year that Yarana first came out in 1999, Ashwini Sutkankar edited Facing the Mirror, Lesbian Writing from India. And this had, writing by Indian lesbians, most of whom did not write under their own names, but they wrote under a pseudonym. And then, more than 10 years later, there was an anthology called Out Stories from the New Queer India, edited by Meenal Hajratwala. Now, this was published by Queer Inc., that many of you may have heard of, which is run by Shobna Kumar, who started India's first full-fledged gay publishing company, which she runs from Bombay, and it's called Queer Inc. So Out was their first book. Um, the subtitle was Stories from the New Queer India. So that was the third anthology, and then there is a forthcoming anthology called Queer Poetry Asia, which is not out yet, as far as I know. It's going to be published by HarperCollins, and the editors are Akhil Katyal and Aditi, and they're both, of course, from within the gay subculture. So that is as far as the anthology. So what I've done is I've given you a quick overview of the creative writing, the critical writing, and the anthologies. I think I could take some questions over here. Sachin?
Yes, Raj. Yeah, so it's a good point to have some questions and observations from the participants. Um, so those
Yeah,
of you who
if there's any of these books about which you want to quiz me in a little more detail,
right.
that is fine because I was just sort of speaking of them in a very um, summarized way,
Mhm.
giving you a very short, brief synopsis. But if there's any of these books about which you, or anything else about aesthetics and whatever I've said so far,
Right.
you're most welcome.
Um, Raj, during your session, Maulik Thakkar had a very interesting comment.
Right.
If Maulik is still with us, he can unmute his mic and share his comment. If not, then I'll just read it out. Maulik,
Okay.
are you with us?
Yes, I was just saying that there's an irony to how discrimination on the basis of caste
Uh-huh.
tends not to lead to people being accused of predatory behavior.
Mhm.
But moral taboos being challenged by literature is always open to attack. It's a
That's right.
soft spot.
That's right. That's right. Thank you, Maulik. Yeah. Um, any observations, any
Just say
comments?
that again. I didn't get it fully. What did he say? Can you
Maulik,
repeat?
yeah, I think he is on mic, so he can repeat.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just saying that you mentioned that literature is always open to the accusation of corrupting the minds of individuals, corrupting
Yeah.
the behavior of individuals. There's an irony to how the imposition of cruelty that is based on caste discrimination isn't open to that sort of accusation, and yet literature is always a soft spot where it's always open to attack.
Yeah, caste is an entirely different ballgame. Caste and gender have acquired a kind of respectability. So even whichever way you present it, whether through literature or history or any other way, people will um, just take it as that's something that is the need of the time. But it's not the same with sexuality, and therefore you said corruption. Yes, corruption. Yes. So so on this basis that somebody can go to court. Now, as I said, that didn't happen after Ismat Chugtai. To the best of my knowledge, none of us were taken to court. But that does not mean that you know that um, that the law wouldn't apply to us, and that is why I started by saying that, to my mind, this is extremely ironic that this body of work was all produced in the backdrop of Section 377, and I think we were all taking a risk, um, whether it's a calculated risk or whether we were being foolhardy. That depends on individual perception. But certainly in my case, I can't speak for others. But in my case, I knew I was taking a risk. But each time you did it and nothing happened, you were emboldened, and then you wanted to do it again and again. And that is how, in my case, over a period of time, I managed to write all these books because then you just came to believe that, okay, this was fine and nothing would happen. The other thing is, as I said, I'm restricting myself to English. And the other thing is that in India, English is definitely a safety valve, because if the same things were written in the regional languages, they would be read by more people. More people would have access to them. Um, rabble rousers would have access to them, and that could, really make it messy. But because the body of work that I have been speaking of has been written in English, the rabble rousers, the kinds of people who um, are likely to, you know, make a noise about it, don't really have access to it, and therefore um, they leave us alone, or we are left alone, and that is the nice thing about it. Also, the other question that people sometimes ask is, did you have trouble with publishers? But the fact that most of this body of work that I have spoken of was brought out by mainstream publishers, Penguin and HarperCollins and Sage, and even my co-translation of Lakshmi Narayan Tripathi's autobiography, Me Hijra, Me Lakshmi, I forgot to mention that, from Marathi into English was brought out by Oxford University Press. So I think that on the whole, publishers and the media in this country have been progressive when it comes to same-sex writing. So there was no problem there. Though Shobna Kumar might beg to differ because that is why maybe she felt the need to start a separate publishing house for gay writing, Queer Ink. But maybe the newer writers, the beginners would need it. Because apart from these names, let me tell you that there are a lot of other younger gay writers as well. If you look at Akhil Khatyal's forthcoming anthology, it's got a lot of poems from different parts of Asia by names, that we've not heard of. So I'm only talking of the more well-known writers who are part of, as Hoshang would say, gay icons, and who are part of the LGBT canon. But there are many others as well.
Yeah. Raj, sorry to interrupt you, but there are like four observations come questions. Shall we take these?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, sure.
Madhura Kulkarni has this question that in the novel Funny Boy, isn't Arji's obsession with marriage a perversion of the institution of marriage itself? Because Arji is the boy bride. So, would you like to address that and then we take the next question?
I talked about it on the first day. I don't know if Madhura was there. Was she there when I
Uh,
talked about homonormativity?
I think she did attend one of like the first session. But Madhura, is this what you wanted to ask, or like you can turn on, you can actually unmute
No,
your.
RG, I'll answer that. Well, RG wanting to be the boy bride can also be, you know, it can be, there's a similar scene in the Boyfriend where Milind and Yuri have a mock marriage. Now, Ruth Vanita comments on this, that in Yuri's flat, they have a mock marriage and they find a sari and they tie it round and so on. So it's a kind of subversion of the idea of marriage.
Mhm.
And that might be the case in Funny Boy as well.
Okay.
But I did say, if you remember,
Yeah.
that there is a derivative concept known as homonormativity, which derives from heteronormativity. And, there are gay people, I would call them um, conservative gay people, like Andre Gide in
Mhm.
Dollimore's book, the first
Yes.
chapter, he's comparing and contrasting Oscar Wilde and Andre Gide. Now,
Mhm.
Andre Gide comes across as a conservative homosexual. So, your question, perversion of the institution of marriage, I don't know from what platform you are speaking, because am I to understand that, are you speaking like the Pope? Because the Pope believes that only a man and a woman can be married.
No, it is like Arji comes from a construct. He comes from a family where, it is mandatory that a man and a woman have to be together, and he itself goes through a lot of confusion when on the way to his, acceptance of his sexuality. That's why I wanted to ask you this.
Yeah, so it's possible that a lot of us are, heteronormative is so all pervasive that a lot of us um, are one way or other, consciously or unconsciously influenced by it, and we tend to be homonormative own in our own lifestyles. And that it's quite likely that RG, because by the time Funny Boy ends, RG is only 13 or 14 years.
13 or
He's not
14
very
years old.
old. Yes, and it takes a while for people to sort their confusions out. So it's a little unfair to say that he's confused because he's not a full-fledged adult as yet.
Yes,
But let me take that further and say that I agree with you that in the real world, heteronormativity is so all-pervasive and um, um, in cultures such as ours, it's so widely prevalent that there are a number of gay people who are influenced by it. I told you the story of Harish Iyer.
yeah,
Where
you
was
did.
it for his mother to actually go to the Times of India and say, I want to have a advertise for a groom for my son? Because I think that really, we need to reject the very institution of marriage and rather than replicate it. I mean, which is not to say that you don't. You don't get together with the people you love and so on. But we have to think of alternative terminology, alternative approaches, and not replicate. To the extent that there is replication, I would call that conservatism and orthodoxy, and most importantly, the inability to think these things through, right?
Yes, yes, sir.
So I think it is imperative for LGBT people for whom their sexuality is not just a preference but an identity to be able to think these things through and intensify their reading and their attend uh, sessions like this so that you hone your thinking. And wherever there are residues, you see, because these residues of conservatism are the most dangerous thing. We
Yes,
don't realize, people might think that, oh, we are very liberated and progressive. Believe me, and late capitalism, of course, is responsible in a broader context. Late capitalism does make the younger generation, the millennial generation, a much more orthodox and conservative than our generation of the 1970s. I don't know what generation you belong to, Madhura, and whether you agree with that, but that is true. And so there would be LGBT people today, who would want to manage their sexual lives exactly as heterosexuals do. That is to say that, they would believe in monogamy, Just a minute.
Yes.
Hello, Rahul, I'm in my webinar. I'll call you later.
Um, Raj,
Sorry about that.
yeah. Raj, sorry to interrupt you, but could you also take two very interesting questions, which are mainly about the critical writing and creative queer writers. So one is by Dr. Preeti Oja, who would like to know what is the response of
Yeah,
the critic.
I'll take those, Sachin, but let
Yes,
me ask Madhura whether I've answered her question. I was
sure,
just
sure,
saying
sure.
that
Yes, yes,
there are
sir.
these residues of conservatism, and we need to negotiate it. I was saying that there are a lot of young gay people who would say that, for one thing, I think that monogamy today has um, you know, if you argue against monogamy, that is seen as irresponsible. And particularly in the post-AIDS world, if you say that I want to have multiple partners and so on, even if you believe in it as an intellectual idea, as
Yeah.
opposed to literally sleeping around, you will be thought to be irresponsible and people will say no. And, if you really examine gay lives, there are a lot of people who have ordered their lives exactly as heterosexuals do. So they will have steady partners, they will be of the same generation, same social class, same caste, same educational background. And to me, all that seems, you know, it seems conservative. It seems that heteronormativity has been substituted by these guys with homonormativity, and that is undesirable.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you,
Okay,
sir.
Yeah,
you're
Yeah.
welcome.
yeah. Thank you, Raj. So shall we take those questions?
Yes.
I'll quickly read out those because I think two questions are quite interrelated. I'll read them one after another. So the first question is, what is the response of critical writings on the original creative queer writers? One. And second, which also sort of connects this, is what are the challenges that queer writings from India face when they are subject to Western queer theory, and how do we navigate this space in Indian academia, and be more representative in our readings?
I don't think the critical writing comes first and the queer writing comes later on. I think that the critical writing that exists is an interpretation of the original gay writing, the fiction and the poetry and the plays and the books of criticism that I referred to, whether it's by Ruth and Salim or by Gautam Bhan, Parmesh Shani, Oliver Ross, um, Andrew Grossman. These are commentaries on the novels and the poems and the films that have been produced. So the critical writing. I'm not talking about critical theory. I'm talking
Mm,
about criticism. There's a
mhm,
difference between literary theory and literary criticism. I'm not talking about literary theory.
mhm,
Literary theory would belong to the realm of aesthetics, and as you know, there is no full-fledged work of queer aesthetics as yet.
mhm,
that is a that is a lacuna that has to be done. I mean, the most famous theorists from Spivak to Baba to Saeed and Ejaz Ahmed and so on, they have restricted themselves to other constituencies, but there is no full-fledged work of queer aesthetics as yet. So the criticism doesn't precede the creative writing, it follows the creative writing. For example, Hoshang Merchant's Forbidden Sex, Forbidden Text, New India's Gay Poets. It's got chapters on Vikram Seth, me, Adil Jasawala, Sultan Padamsi, Suniti Namdoshi. It's got chapters where it's talking about our work, right?
right,
And
right.
the other critical works would also be of that kind. What was the other question about?
Anup Sharma had this question, like, what are the challenges that queer writings from India face? This is especially, when they are subject to Western queer theory. So how do we
No,
navigate?
I don't think that writers are bothered with theory. Theory is what academics are bothered with. People like me who teach LGBT studies, but everybody who's a gay writer is not a professor of
Mhm.
queer studies. So I don't think they're bothered about theories. They tend to write about themselves, their love life. As I said, a lot of the gay writing is autobiographical. Um, um, that's part of its aesthetics. As in the case of Dalit writing and black writing and women's writing, it tends to be autobiographical. So they're really, they're not concerned with queer theory. They're
Mhm.
not concerned with Butler and Sedgwick and Foucault and so on. Now,
Right.
in some way, that is a critical function. If someone's doing a PhD on, say, my work, then you might apply, some theories of Butler or Sedgwick to interpret my work, as my friend and former student Huzaifa Pandit has done. He's written a
Mhm.
lot of essays on my work, and that's what he does. But the writing itself is pretty oblivious of the theory. It
Right.
tends to be much more subjective and immediate and personal,
Right.
right?
Right. Thank you, Raj. Dipti has a very interesting question. She
Yeah.
wishes to know, is most of the queer literature in India elitist? Or do we have examples of writers from small town talking about their issues which are obviously different from those in a slightly privileged social position?
There is both kinds of writing. There are those who are not from metro cities,
Mm-hmm.
but as I said, because I'm restricting myself to English,
Mm-hmm.
it's more likely that the writing tends to be metro city based. There
Mm-hmm.
are other writers as well. Bhupen Kakkar was a famous homosexual painter, and he has written short stories in Gujarati.
Right.
Kamleshwar wrote homosexual stories in Hindi.
Right.
Um, then there are writers who write in Marathi and so on. So
Yes.
that would, I don't think whether it's metropolitan or provincial makes that much of a difference. Because if you say metropolis and province,
Mm-hmm.
the point is that you are then, you're migrating to some other territory.
Right.
The metropolis province binary applies to post colonial writing, right? That is
Mm-hmm.
where that binary operates. Now, for for gay writing, the binary is gay versus straight, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
whether it is coming from the metropolis or from a smaller town should not really make that much of a difference. I
Yes.
have argued about this, that that each of these constituencies needs to break free and establish itself as an autonomous category. Unfortunately, it's very hard for gay writing to be able to do that because of the nature of our constituency, which is sex and sexuality. But we're certainly getting there, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So
Right.
my answer to your question is that if you think in terms of metropolis and province, it means that you are subsuming gay writing under the larger category of post-colonial writing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and unfortunately, that happens to gay writing all the time. We tend to get subsumed under older categories. It could be post-colonial, it could be caste, it could be gender, and
And
that's what I was saying the other day. That in many universities they have a course called Gender and Sexuality Studies, where 80% of the course would be only about gender, and just a small percentage would be about sexuality. So my feeling is, and I've argued about this in some of my books as well, that you need to establish the autonomy of gay writing and not allow it to be subsumed under these older categories of um, class, race, caste, gender, and so on.
Right. Thank you, Raj. I think we should continue the session because the questions can wait for some more time. Um, we could take some questions towards the end. Yes, Raj.
Okay, so I'll just move from literature to films. Um, and again, we begin in the 90s. The same thing that I said about literature would apply to these movies as well, that these movies were made when Section 377 was very much a part of Indian law, and it criminalized homosexuality, um, which was punishable with jail sentence and so on, non-bailable offense. And these films were made at that time when the law was very much in force. So let me start with Riyad Wadia's Bombay, made in 1996. I mentioned a book called Queer Asian Cinema Shadows in the Shade by Andrew Grossman, you know, published in New York. It has an essay by Riyad Wadia called Long Life of a Short Film. And he talks about the genesis of Bombay. You know, right from the time somebody introduced us, because I began writing these series of poems that I called Bomb Gay. Now that's another portmanteau word, Bombay and gay, and that's how you get Bomb Gay. And the book I mentioned the other day, Alka Anjeria, Reading India Now, actually has a whole section where she uses this term and says that that is the difference. Somebody asked me last time the difference between, and even the previous question that was asked, the difference between post-colonial writing and and gay writing. You know what Alka Anjeria very interestingly says? She says there was Bombay, then there was Mumbai. And if you look at the difference between Bombay and Mumbai, then you understand the difference between the colonial and post-colonial, right? But she says there is a third category, and that is, or a third label that you can give to the city, and she says that that is Bombay, and that means that you couldn't care less whether it's called Bombay or it's called Mumbai, but for you, what matters is the gay life in Bombay. And of course, Parmesh Shani's book was also called Gay Bombay because that is what that support group was called. But in my case, I clubbed these two words and Bombay and gay and made it Bombay. So I was working on these poems, and Riyad talks about how we met and how I was going to the international writing program in Iowa, and they asked me to bring a video of some of my work, and how the idea came to him to make this short film of only 11 minutes. Um, but it was an explosive film for that time. Explosive, even if it were to be made now in 2020, I would still call it explosive because it actually has frontal nudity. It has a butt shot of Raoul Bose, you know. So it easily can be misconstrued as pornography, hardcore porn. And for that reason, he never submitted it for censor certification, and it never got proper release or anything. But ironically, it went to all the film festivals in India and abroad, and it got rave reviews, and it continues to be talked about. You know, people write about it, and you know, from time to time, people ask me, "Do you have a copy?" I just have an old DVD of it, and because Riyadh passed away and his family didn't really do anything to, you know, to preserve the film, it's almost lost. But I think that that was one of the first, and of course, it was called India's first gay film. If you read commentaries, even on YouTube and so on Google, it will be described as India's first gay film. Very explicit, very explosive. Only 11 minutes, a short film based on poems. So it's not a narrative film. You know, what he does is he takes each of these poems, which are very short, they are like vignettes, and then he films them, and the poems are being narrated by a stage actor, Rajit Kapoor, who incidentally also performed my play, The Wisest Fool on Earth, which is a monologue set in a toilet, from where this man is speaking to an audience and talking about being homosexual and being picked up and so on. So that's called The Wisest Fool on Earth. I didn't mention it. It was also translated and done in Hindi. But So that is the technique that he uses in Gay. From the first to the second, there are 6 films in all. There's one called Underground, which deals with a gay bashing sequence in a washroom in BT, and the things like that. There's one called Enema, which is using enema as a metaphor for anal sex, and stuff like that. So that was Gay 1996. 2 years later, there was the film Fire, which of course was on a much larger scale, um, an international film, because the director, Deepa Mehta, lives in Canada and not in India, and it was made in English and in Hindi. But it was set in India, in Delhi, and it depicts in a middle class Indian household a lesbian relationship, love affair that takes place between these 2 sisters-in-law in the house, both of whose husbands have different reasons for not being interested in them. In the case of elder, um, the elder lady, the elder sister-in-law, the husband has become spiritual, and so he thinks, and they don't have children, and he thinks that he's gone beyond sex. Maybe he's in the vanaprastha stage of his life, so he spends a lot of time with his guru, attending discourses and so on. In the case of the younger sister-in-law, um, her story is more interesting because her husband already had a girlfriend, and but the family wouldn't allow him to marry that girlfriend because she was Chinese or something. And so he said, "Well, okay, I'll have this arranged marriage, but I'm not going to stop seeing my girlfriend." You know, so that is his reason for not having a proper conjugal life with his wife. So both these wives, in a way, are neglected wives, and that is when they discover each other. They discover each other's bodies. They discover each other's emotions, and it becomes a very intense relationship between them. Which, of course, there is a servant in the house who first comes to know, and then he spills the beans, and then the husbands come to know, and in the shame culture in which we live, of course. Their honor is violated, and that is the story of Fire. I'm sure you've seen it, or if you've not seen it, you must see it. Today, it can easily be accessed, but when it came out, that was not the case. The Hindu right wing, and particularly the Shiv Sena, was very quick to ask for a ban on the film because they said it's an immoral film. Now, they were not. They didn't go to court and say that this is violating 377. I don't think they did that. The Shiv Sena didn't even need to go to the courts because they are law unto themselves. So what they did was, under Mr. Bal Thackeray's blessings, they started vandalizing cinemas where this film was shown, tearing the seats and setting the cinema on fire and so on, so that it had to be pulled out of the cinemas. And then they issued statements in the press, not just they, but even their wives. The women's wing of the Shiv Sena, the Mahila Agadi of the Shiv Sena, issued a statement and said that if women turn to each other to satisfy their needs, what happens to the institution of the family? I deconstructed that statement and found it very interesting because I said that the first thing that this tells me is that they are aware of the fact that women can satisfy their needs by turning to each other. So it's not as if they are unaware of lesbianism. But secondly, they talk about the institution of the family being at threat. Now, this told me that they were so completely co-opted by the patriarchy, that they wanted to safeguard an institution called the family, which is an extremely patriarchal institution. You know, they were talking about safeguarding. They were saying, what happens to the institution of the family? I mean, and the family is, and if women cannot see that the family is a patriarchal institution, and then as I argued, Shiv Sena women at that, who for all you know, are victims of, wife beating and so on, because the men there are obviously patriarchal to the core, but they were completely blind to the liberating possibilities of lesbianism, which was what the film was really, that was the point of view, that lesbianism has um, possibilities for liberation. And that is how the film ends, actually, with these two women deciding to walk out on their husband and spend the rest of their lives together. But that film was made in Hindi and in English, and as I said, for the first few years, it was it went through a lot of trouble, a lot of violence, and so on. One of the things that Mr. Bal Thackeray himself said, he said that why have you, because the two sisters-in-law in the family were called Sita and Radha, and he said, why have you given these two ladies Hindu names, meaning that there are no lesbians in the Hindu community? And he said, give them Muslim names. And since one of the roles was played by Shabana Azmi, who is a Muslim, he said, why don't you call one of the characters Shabana? So he made the attack personal. So that is fire. And, Shohini Ghosh, who's again a very important name when it comes to LGBT studies, she teaches at Jamia Millia, and she has this monograph on fire published by Arsenal Press in Canada. And you must try and get hold of this book if you really want a detailed analysis of the film Fire. So that was 1998, before the turn of the century. Then the 20th century, of course, gives way to the 21st, and there were some more films made. More than 10 years after Fire, Karan Johar and others, Javed Akhtar's daughter, what's her name? They made this anthology film, right, with 5 or 6 different short films in one film, and that was called Bombay Talkies. Now, the first Bombay Talkies film, directed by Karan Johar, it's got an independent title which I can't remember, but I can never remember. But that is about a boy who is homosexual, thrown out by his parents, and gets a job as a journalist in a newspaper where Rani Mukherjee is the editor, and then goes to their house and falls in love with Rani Mukherjee's husband, and realizes that the husband is actually a closet gay, and outs him, and that is the story. So I think that is a significant film, Bombay Talkies, because it's about hypocrisy and double standards, and how it's putting its finger on something that is very much a part of Indian reality, which is that a lot of gay men are in the closet, and they lead double lives, and they get married, and they pretend to be heterosexual, but they're actually not. So really, this young man makes this his boss's husband see that he should be more honest about his sexuality. Aligarh came out only in 2016, and it's based on a real life incident that happened in Aligarh Muslim University in 2010, where this professor of Marathi, who was very close to retirement, became a victim of homophobia. He lived on campus, and they had this sting operation by which he was caught having sex with a rickshaw driver. And then, of course, all hell broke loose. The university turned against him. The local press turned against him. His students turned against him. He was asked to leave the university. He was suspended. His electricity was cut off. He had to look for alternative accommodation in the town, and nobody was willing to give him accommodation. Um, Ironically, this happened in the year, the real life incident happened in 2010. Now, in 2010, we, 377 got a 4.5 year reprieve between 2009 and July 2013. I told you about this while discussing the law, where the Delhi High Court had read down, Justice A.P. Shah read down 377 and said it wouldn't apply to consenting adult homosexuals. Now, this is when this incident happened, and therefore, activists from the NAS Foundation and the Lawyers Collective who fought this professor, his name was Srinivas Ramchandra Siras, and they fought his case in the Allahabad High Court and won the case. And the Allahabad High Court asked the university to reinstate him and return, let him get back to work and give him his flat back and so on. So it was victory for him, but ironically, again, he was found dead even before this um, order of the court could be delivered to him. The reasons for his death are shrouded in mystery. Was it a suicide? Was it a murder? People think it was a suicide, but it could have been a suicide because, he was so, he was shamed to such an extent. Now, whenever I use the word shame, remember what I said on the first day, that in India, we live in a shame culture. And homosexuality is a matter of shame and honor. It's not a matter of guilt. It's not as if you're sinning, as Islam and Christianity might hold that homosexuality is a sin. In Hindu India, you don't see it as a sin, but you're worried about your honor being violated and you're worried about being shamed. It seems to me that this man couldn't face the prospect. If he'd not won the case, that might have actually been better for him, because having won the case, he would have to go back to the university and face his colleagues and face his students who had, spared no attempt to humiliate him, and that seemed like an impossible thought. So he probably thought it was better to end his life. So that is Aligarh. There are a couple of other films, Margarita with a Straw, which I haven't personally seen, but it deals with both disability and sexuality at the same time. So that's a movie worth seeing. And there are recent films like, like Kapoor and Sons and Ek Ladki Ko Dekha To Aisa Laga. And I haven't seen those films, and I don't think that they've dealt with it very seriously. Another film I forgot to mention is Rituparno Ghosh's Memories in March. Now he of course worked from Bengal and not from the Bombay film industry, but Memories in March was made in Hindi, and that's another important gay film. Now, apart from these individual gay films, you should know that we have an LGBT film festival culture in India, and you're lucky, all of you who are in Bombay, because the most famous LGBT film festival called Kashish happens in Bombay every year in the last week of May. It's curated by Sridhar Rangayan, who's a filmmaker himself. He's not made feature films, but he's made shorter films like Bombay. A famous film of Sridhar, his first famous film was Gulabi Aina. And then there are others as well who make these shorter films which become part of the festival circuit. Um, but they also get films from other parts of the world. The South Korean film Burning is a film that one can cite. It's not an Indian film, but it would be something that you would see as part of the LGBT film festival. Kashish, you can easily enroll. It doesn't cost anything, and they have screenings in multiple venues, Liberty in South Bombay and other venues in Juhu and so on. So that is Kashish. So overall, this is how This is what the film scene looks like. But there's something else I want to say. This is of course about films which are LGBT films per se. But there is another way in which films can be brought into this discourse, and that is when you look at mainstream films which are not intended to be gay by any stretch, but you can come up with queer readings of these mainstream films. And that is, an interesting and a worthwhile exercise. I want to say over here that I want to say over here that I'm going to quote something from a critic by the name of Alexander Doughty. And he says, I'll just read this. He says, films ostensibly addressed to straight audiences have greater potential for encouraging a wide range of queer responses than films clearly addressed to gay and lesbian audiences. You get that? Shall I read that again? Films addressed to straight audiences have greater potential for encouraging a wide range of queer responses than films clearly addressed to gay and lesbian audiences. Hello? Yes? I don't think I got it. What is it about?
Hi, in the meanwhile, those of you who have your videos on, may I request you to turn them off for some time? Devyani, Dr. Santosh Rathod, Gopan, may I request you to turn off your videos? Afifa,
You just WhatsApp the question or you email the questions. RAJRAO, Raj Rao, 2015 at gmail.com. Raj Rao, RAJRAO, 2015. Yes. Okay, thank you. Yeah, yeah. Bye. Sorry about that. Can you hear me? Hello?
yes, Raj, you are audible.
This is what Alexander Doughty says, that actually, if you take LGBT films, of course, they are addressed to LGBT audiences, and there's not that much of a challenge over there. But it's much more challenging to take mainstream films and then have queer readings of these mainstream films, which were not intended to be queer in the first place. you know so that is something that has been happening in Indian cinema for quite a long time now. If you read this book Shadows in the Shade, edited by Andrew Grossman, there are essays by Ashok Rao Kavi, there are essays by Gayatri Gopinath, there's an essay by me as well. um, and in this book, Queering India, there's an essay by Murli Dharan, who's doing the same thing, not with Hindi cinema, but with Malayalam cinema, and looking at mainstream films, but attempting queer readings of these mainstream films. Now, in my case, and of course, Ashok Rao Kavi and others have also spoken about Sholay. Actually, Amitabh Bachchan's entire oeuvre, right from Zanjeer, 1973 onwards, it sort of it it alters the grammar of Hindi cinema as we knew it before that time. Because before that time, uh, Hindi films were very romantic. You had heroes and heroines, and they were out and out heterosexual love stories where the heroines romanced heroines and they sang songs and so on. Now, there are films of Bachchan which also do that, but his more successful films are actually not romantic films but action films, where where he was always teamed up with another male hero, right? But then it was a friendship which also sort of verged on romance. So it was not just friendship, and this was particularly brought out by the songs. If you think of many of Bachchan's films of that time, and deconstruct the songs. Let me give you an example. The most famous song in Sholay, "Ye Dosti Hum Na Todenge." You know, if you look at the lyrics of that song, if you look at the visuals of that song, it is very easy to uh, read it as a gay song, right? Because for one thing, let me speak about the visuals first. There's a lot of there's a lot of bodily contact between these two men, right? I used the word homosociality, of course, earlier, and I'm going to return to that term. But homosociality, as we know it in the West, doesn't really um, include that much of body contact as you see in the Sholay song. You can watch it on your phones or anything and see that from the word go, they start by um, holding hands and so on. But by the time that song ends, you have one of them perched on the shoulders of the other and stroking his hair and so on. So there's a lot of physical touch between these two men. And then you combine that with the lyrics, because the lyrics suggest that this friendship is certainly more than a um, platonic friendship. It is a sort of they're talking about wanting to spend the rest of their lives together. Khana pina saath hai, marna jeena saath hai, sari zindagi, and so on. So it's very easy then to use um, queer theory. This is what you were asking me. Some of you were asking me earlier that how do you apply, and this is how you apply. That you take the theories that you already know, and then you apply them to these films and these songs, and they yield wonderful results. Murli Dharan has done the same thing with Malayalam cinema, where he looks at Mammootty and Mohanlal, these two actors, if you're familiar with Malayali cinema, and he says, it's the same sort of equation as Amitabh Bachchan has with many of his um, male heroes, male co-stars in all his films, right from Zanjeer. In Zanjeer, for example, he sings this song with Pran, or rather Pran sings to him, Yari hai iman meri yaar meri zindagi. In Dostana, there are songs with Shatrughan Sinha, Mere dost kissa ye kya ho gaya, suna hai कि tum bewafa ho gaya, Salamat rahe dostana hamara. Not the later dostana which Karan Johar made with his son, but the older dostana. And actually, in this Andrew Grossman book, my former student and I, Jia Das, and I, we translated some of these songs and commented on each one of them. So this is exactly the thing that Alexander Doty talks about, that you can look at mainstream films and reread them in the light of queer theory, queer studies. And I think that as far as Bollywood is concerned, that yields wonderful results, particularly from the 1970s onwards. Once Amitabh Bachchan comes and the romantic film is replaced by the action film, he looked very awkward. Even now, if you see old films where he has to sing songs with heroines, Rajesh Khanna and Shami Kapoor and Shashi Kapoor look good doing that. But Amitabh Bachchan, he was gangly, he was lanky, he looked very odd doing that. Except maybe in Silsila, they brought it off. But if you see other, I don't know whether you agree with me, but he looked very awkward doing that. But he came across very well with the other men. Think of Diwar, with Shashi Kapoor and all those famous lines, Mere paas maa hai and so on. So this is the kind of um, interpretation that is possible with mainstream movies. And I think that Sachin's own thesis was about this to some extent, isn't it, Sachin? And but there are other people who are doing similar work. So are there any questions over here about
Um,
this?
People have certain observations, but I don't see a question. But if anyone has
Okay,
a question, maybe we could ask them
there's
to.
something else I want to say about Eve Sedgwick's second book, which I mentioned the other day, Between Men, and her essay called Gender Asymmetry and Erotic Triangles. In the context of homosociality, because you see, what you see in these films, whether it's Mammootty and Mohanlal or Amitabh Bachchan and his co-stars in films like Sholay and Zanjeer and so on, can be explained in terms of homosociality. But it is a kind of homosociality, that goes beyond the conventional and acceptable definition of homosociality. So that is what, of course, Eve Sedgwick is not talking about Hindi films. She's talking about Western culture. But I think that it certainly applies to um, a lot of the mainstream movies that that you have in Bollywood. So let's see if there are some observations, and then I'll come back to this. Go ahead.
Yeah, Raj. Shall we take a couple of questions?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, yeah.
Questions or
I'm
comments.
sorry. Yeah. Tanya has a question, but I'll request Tanya to unmute her mic and share her question. She also has certain observation about this very popular song, Sheila Ki Jawani, uh, again on which Zoya Akhtar had made her film, short film, which was screened along with other short films in the anthology called Bombay Talkies.
Yeah,
Tanya,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So
I was forgetting the name Zoya Akhtar, so thanks for
yeah,
reminding.
yeah.
Javed Akhtar?
Hello,
Tanya,
hello,
please
yes, sir.
ask your question.
Uh, yes, Raj, so we were just discussing about how the song Sheila Ki Jawani is kind of autoerotic in some of the lyrics that it has.
Right.
And yeah, I think you'll agree with me on that.
Yeah, yeah, I
Um,
agree with you. And there are
okay,
some lyrics that you know better than I do. There are some lyrics that
right.
I know better because these things also tend to be generational. So I'm citing examples from the 70s when I was of your age and I saw films and so on. But this, applies to films across generations. And I think that this is
Right.
the most rewarding and interesting exercises for
Hmm.
students of queer studies. And that's exactly what Alexander Doughty is saying, that if you take a film that's already a gay film,
Right.
there's only so much that you can say about it. But if there
Correct.
is a film that is not meant to be a gay film, then there's,
Hmm.
of course, your
Sir,
interpretation, your original interpretation. Just give me a minute.
yes,
I'll
yes.
try to do my best.
Yeah. Since Raj was constantly talking about these bromances and films made in 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, I had the opportunity to work on some of these films since I was working on queer cinema in India. So it was very interesting to observe that how these romance films, especially where there was a lot of male bonding, the
Hmm.
kind of chemistry that two male actors shared on screen, and I'm talking about the physical spaces that they shared, was amazing. what happened to this is that when Dostana was made, all of a sudden this entire narrative, got changed. Maybe Bollywood became very conscious of the kind of spaces that it allowed two male actors to share, and definitely the very dynamic of this space sharing changed after Dostana, because Dostana made it very obvious, and Dostana was obviously not very, it was not a serious attempt to kind of depict uh, gay relations, but then it definitely damaged the already existing narrative of male bonding.
True,
Yeah,
true.
yeah, thank you.
Um, Raj sir, actually, I had a question.
Yeah.
Um, the question is like, there are several Indian films and even TV shows and reality shows where, as a sidetrack, you will see that there's a lot of comical representation of the gay subject. Like, if I think Pyar Kiya To Darna Kya, or even Student of the Year, where as a sidetrack there are gay relationships going on, and it is represented in a very comical fashion. So what is your commentary on that?
That does a lot of damage actually because they're really cashing in on a stereotype. So
Right,
I think that has to be that has to be critiqued in the strongest possible terms because it's very easy to how do we deal with marginal people? That's the best way to deal with marginal people. You make fun of them. And in the
right,
case of GBD people, it relates to what I was saying the other day about body shaming, right? Because
right.
it starts with their manner of speech and their manner of walking, right?
Hmm.
So these very stereotypical feminine mannerisms that are given to gay men, even in Dostana, which Sachin just mentioned, not the main characters, but if you take the Boman Irani character in Dostana, who's really homosexual, because the other um, John Abraham and Abhishek Bachchan are only pretending to be gay because they want an apartment. But Boman Irani is really gay, and the moment he walks in, you see that he has this coquettish walk and this
Right,
lift hand and so on. So that's a part of it. This has to be actually censured in the strongest possible language.
right,
Um, any marginal character, if he comes on the scene and the audience um, breaks into laughter,
hmm.
I think it should make us very angry. You know,
Right,
unless it's self-deprecatory humor by the uh, writer himself. Like in a lot of my work, I might laugh at myself
hmm.
to the extent that I am there in my own work, right? Um, Now that is different because that is self-deprecatory humor where you're turning the spotlight on yourself and laughing at yourself. So that can be seen somewhat differently. But to laugh at um, for others to laugh at gay characters is highly objectionable. So I think
Right,
that wherever you see this, um, you have to know what's going on. You have to know why it's going on, and for one thing, it's politically incorrect, to laugh at marginal people because the same thing was done with black people. They were called
right.
Negroes. The same thing was
Hmm.
done with ethnic minorities, Parsis, for example. The Parsi Bawaji in Hindi films is always a comic character.
Right.
The moment he comes on the screen, everybody's supposed to laugh. The Sardar ji. So um, I don't think you should even take that seriously. On the
Yeah,
contrary,
I think it's very sad that on the one hand you have serious films taking up this issue, and simultaneously you have films which are just, you know, depicting these comical representations of it,
yeah, but I think that today the audience and even the critics have become a little more aware. So
conscious of it. Huh.
I don't think that film writers can do this as easily as they did it in the past.
True,
You
true.
know,
Yeah.
For
think that's a
example, I
good
was
thing.
seeing yesterday. I'll give you an example. I was seeing Cyrus Brocha does this week that wasn't. It's one of the only
Right,
watchable shows on TV because it's got a lot of humor and so on.
right.
So yesterday, because of the lockdown and all that, we see this man on his laptop, and then he says, "I was making models." Cyrus Brocha asked him, "What were you doing?" He said, "Well, I can't go out, so I'm making models on my laptop, on my computer. But my
Okay.
wife is very angry." So he says, "Why should she be angry if you're making models on the laptop?" And then he says, "No, no, no. I got it wrong. I was making out with models on my laptop." Okay, there's a difference. So then what Brocha asks him is, "Oh, men or women?" And then his answer, because see, that's the tricky question. His
Right,
answer is both, and then Cyrus Brocha immediately says, "Oh, it doesn't matter." You know. Now, if he didn't do that, you would
right,
accuse him of. You can accuse him of anything. You can accuse him of homophobia,
right.
right? So I think that today, because I hear FM radio and all that, Raji Masand and people like that. So I think that today there's a little more awareness, and
True.
people can't do it with the same kind of irresponsibility with which they did it earlier.
Mm-hmm.
But this is not to say that it doesn't happen, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And
true.
particularly not gay people so much as trans people. Today, I think that the whole comedy has shifted to trans people, right?
Right,
The
right,
humor,
right. True.
right? Because they are obviously even more gullible.
True, true.
Homosexual men and women can pass for straight, and because of heterosexism, nobody knows what your sexuality is. But trans people, take the hijras on the street, right?
Hmm.
You think we are being kind to them? We're good to them? No. So whether it's trans women or trans men, they are much more vulnerable to this, even in films.
True,
Even in
true. I
films,
think
there are
someone commented on that as well, that the transgender community has not been represented adequately in literature and
there are
film.
no serious films on them. Where are there
Yeah,
serious films on trans people? You have some sort of comic interlude. I remember in the 70s there was Amar Akbar Anthony, and you have a whole song with hijras. Taya Bali Pyar Ka Dushman, hi, hi, yeah,
yeah,
becoming
yeah.
and clapping and so on.
Right,
So that is how they've been portrayed. And as students of queer studies, this is also part of our job, to deride these portrayals and comment on them because they're very irresponsible, they are mindless, um, and they are done, just to sort of, they're done for commercial reasons, maybe.
yeah,
You can't laugh at somebody else's expense today, whoever it is, not just trans people. You can't laugh at anybody else's expense. It's, for one thing, it's politically incorrect to do so, but often people don't realize this. And then coming, what goes with that is a whole lot of abusive terms
right.
like, like chakka and
Hmm.
pansy and faggot and number six and stuff like that. So or negro. So all this is part of this um, machinery, I would call it, of queer studies to take note of these things and comment on them and critique them.
Okay.
Okay?
Thank you so much, sir.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Raj, thank you very much for that comment. It seems that people have a lot of uh,
Yeah, yeah, go ahead.
comments in the chat box, especially
So go right
uh,
ahead.
yeah. Um, Preeti Oza, Dr. Preeti Oza has made a comment. So if she is with us right now, I request her to unmute her audio and maybe just share her views. And also, if there is any question, she can ask. Dr. Preeti Oza? Are
Yes,
you
yes,
with us? Yes,
yes. Am I
ma'am, please.
audible? Good
Yes.
afternoon, Dr. Raj. Good
Yeah,
afternoon,
yeah,
Dr.
hi.
Sachin.
Hi.
See, we
Good
have
afternoon.
a very big body of documentary films also on the same issue. And the mainstream cinema is maybe, in my opinion, putting just one dimensional, you know, picture of the issue. But if you really go through real good documentaries like Breaking Free and all, uh, though it is not reaching out to a larger audience, but it will give a very substantial and very in-deep view on, the issue. This is what is my understanding. Can I have
Yeah,
your comment on this, Dr.
that's
Raj?
true. No, that's true. But what's going on there is that you're preaching to the converted, right? Because who is the audience for these documentaries are people like you and me who already know these things. The documentaries, the film festival films, they don't reach out to a mass audience. So you can't really change mindsets and change perception. That is the unfortunate thing. If they reached out to a mainstream audience, then I'd agree with what you're saying. But they reach out to a niche audience who already know these things. Whenever I go to LGBT films, okay, there's a point of view that is being made, but I already know what
Yes,
that
sir.
point
But
of view
when we
is.
are talking about the actual queer and LGBT issues, uh, sorry, but then my opinion is most of these mainstream films, they are just putting in very, very simple, one-dimensional, static view of the issue. Either complete
Exactly. So
emotional
that
bonding or the lack of, availability. It's just one part of it is, showed in that.
Yeah, so that is what has to be critiqued, wherever you see it. Wherever you see that, the one dimensional aspect of it and so on, if you're a movie critic, then you critique it, right? In the strongest possible terms. Don't worry about being harsh, don't worry about being nice, you don't have to be nice. That is what you do. But more than that, is what I was saying earlier and what I quoted Doti and I gave you examples from both Hindi and Malayali cinema, where you take mainstream films which are not intended to be gay, but which can be interpreted in terms of gayness. I just saw another question from Tushar.
Yeah,
Is homosexuality a disability? Is that the question?
yeah.
Hello?
Yeah,
Hello?
yeah.
Sir, that's not the actual question. I'm just worrying about the treatment of homosexuality on screen as a disability. For example, if you have watched this movie, a Marathi movie called Zogwa, so there,
Yeah,
though
I've seen that.
yeah, though it deals with the superstitious practices in the cult called Zogap or Zogta, so the main focus is of a straight man or a hetero man becoming, a victim of a particular tradition. In that, the treatment of other homosexual men who became a Zogta
Yeah,
because of the social misunderstanding or social negligence or unacceptability of those
yeah,
people in society. So in that sense, the society, even the representation where there is a dialogue between the master and Tayappa, where he says, I'm not like all of them. They are third gender persons, so they belong to Jokta community, but I am a hetero person. So in that sense, even the representation, does it actually represent them as, they belong to a particular platform, for example, Jogappa community, if not the mainstream society?
see, I agree with you, and Jogwa is not a very good example. It's a bit like Vijay Tendulkar's play, Mitrachi Goshta. Now, one way to classify this, you know, is to see who is behind the enterprise. Is the person behind the enterprise an insider, meaning is he from within the community or is he an outsider? And if he is an outsider and not from within the community, you can be sure that this sort of thing will happen, right? And
Mm-hmm.
in our critique of it, this is what we have to point out that what business does somebody who's not from the LGBTQIA plus subculture himself, what business does he have to meddle with such a subject in the first place? And you know, he can't even say in his defense that he has the freedom of speech to do so. He can't say that anymore in his defense. So he has to be, if you're a student of queer studies, regardless of your own sexuality, but if you're a honest, faithful student of queer studies, then you will lambast such a person for meddling in a subject about which he is biased and prejudiced to start with. You see? Because that is what
True.
homophobia is, isn't it? So, in all the
Yes.
examples that you guys are giving, I think key question is um, the key question is who is behind the enterprise, you know? And if the
Mhm.
person, I'm not saying that if someone is not behind the enterprise, he can't do it, but it's much more difficult. It's a tightrope walk. And of course, each film or each text will have to be um, judged on its own merit. You can't even generalize, but on the whole, it wouldn't be incorrect to say. For example, Makran Paranjpe many years ago wrote a novel called Narrator with a gay character. And I ripped the novel apart and I said that Makran Paranjpe, who is so avowedly heterosexual, and I know him personally, so I know his love life as well, you know, or even Bikram Chandra wrote this story called Artha, which many people liked the story, but I felt that he was looking at a homosexual, um, even a casual homosexual encounter, as one would look, as he would look at a casual heterosexual encounter, and I said so. So my response to what you are saying is that for me, this is the um, this is what decides it. Who is behind the enterprise? The personal is the political, right? So the people who
Right.
make yoga, even this business of saying I'm not like you, using and theming, they are different and we are, you don't even have to use pronouns like that, which are very alienating. So that is the answer to your question. That
Thank you, Raj.
if it is shown as sort of sickness or disability or you know some kind of shortcoming, you can be sure that the person behind it is not from within the subculture. It's like a white man writing about black people or a Brahmin writing about Dalits. It's like that. So with sexuality also you need to understand that you have to see it, you have to binarize it in those ways. That's what each Sedgwick says, that we are used to doing when it comes to other constituencies. When it comes to race, you understand the difference between black and white. And if a white man writes about black people and portrays the black person in an unfavorable light, you will know exactly what's going on. And you will say, well, you're white and that is why you're doing this, right? Or if a Brahmin does that, if, as I said today, nobody would dare to write Untouchable the way Mulkraj Anand wrote it in 1935. You know, he'll be attacked. But when it comes to sexuality, unfortunately, we are not yet able to polarize or binarize it in this way. That is what is important. And that is why on the very first day, if you recall, I said that we have to start with binaries. And the sexuality binary is made up of heterosexuality on the empowered side of the binary, and then all the other sexualities on the non-empowered side of the binary. So that is the question to ask. And if, as I said, somebody is meddling with something that, to which constituency he doesn't belong, you can be sure, 9 times out of 10, you can be sure that the portrayal will be unsatisfactory. his prejudices and biases will be reflected in the portrayal, and you have to attack it for those reasons. Okay?
Yeah, Raj, thank you very much. I wish we could continue this discussion, but I think this session has served its purpose by raising certain questions, doubts. I'm sure that our scholars, they have a takeaway for something to ponder over, something to work on, uh, maybe with their present research projects, or maybe in future they might take this up. But I think this session was very encouraging and motivating in that sense. So just
There's just one little thing that's left out, which I just wanted to
yes, Raj,
introduce
please,
you guys to. And
please.
this is an essay by Eve Sedgwick called Gender Asymmetry and Erotic Triangles. Very applicable to a lot of our mainstream Hindi films, not just Amitabh Bachchan's films, but even other films, mainstream Hindi cinema. Now, what she says is that this is how homosociality operates, especially male homosociality. Supposing that's why she calls it erotic triangles. Supposing you had two men in love with the same woman, okay? You have two men in love with the same woman. So it's a love triangle, right? The woman is at the apex, and then the two men are at two ends of the base of the triangle. Is that clear? Yes?
Yes, Raj.
Now, if one of them sacrifices the woman for the other man, right? What would you say? How would you interpret this? Because this is there in a lot of, even in foreign cinema, you might find storylines of this sort, that two men are in love with the same woman. They are in love with the same woman because they don't know that they are in love with the same woman. And then, of course, they are friends, the two men are friends, and then it's later on that they realize that they are in love with the same woman. And then each one wants to sacrifice the woman for the other. What would you say about this? I'm asking you a question.
Raj, could you repeat your question?
Yeah, the question is that there are two men and one woman. The men are friends and they're both in love with the same woman, but they don't know that they both love the same woman. They don't know that at the beginning, but they come to know that later on that they both love the same woman. And then each one is willing to sacrifice the woman for the other man, each friend. So
Right.
what would you say about this?
Okay. Okay.
Okay.
Tanya has a comment, sir. She says that it could imply that they have gay feelings for each other, but I guess like it explicit, we won't be able to say things like this explicitly, but what it simply means is that you prioritize your male bonding, your friendship over relationship with a woman. Okay, Diksha also has certain comments. Raj, if you can see this in the chat box.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Isha says that their love for each other is greater than their love for the woman, whereas Madhura says that, Diksha says that I think that it's the woman's decision. Well, I don't think here in such narratives, woman's decision really matters, except for a film like Sajan, where Madhuri say she does talk about this, like when these men decide to sacrifice their love interest, over their friendship or male bonding, she steps in and she starts questioning that. But with the 1990s discourse, this has never happened, as Raj may have like mentioned in his talk, and also in many essays he has constantly talked about these relations.
Yeah, so Eve Sedgwick uses this to demonstrate, to illustrate her idea of homosociality. And some of you are on the right track. That what, first of all, what it means is that the woman is objectified and is deprived of agency. So she's not consulted. Her, because obviously she also would have preferences, she would prefer one over the other, but that is not taken into account. And the men objectify her and decide between themselves who is going to get her. So this is how, um, you know, this is the gender asymmetry that um, it would be gender symmetrical, because asymmetry is the opposite of symmetry. It would be gender symmetrical if two men love the same woman, but then, you know, the woman decides whom she wants and the other one just sort of backs out, and that is more conducive to symmetry. But this is asymmetrical because the reason these two men are trading this woman off between themselves would imply that it is a homosociality which goes beyond uh, simple homosociality, you know, and it sort of veers on a kind of eroticism that might exist. That's what somebody said. Not full-scale homosexuality, but a kind of eroticism that might exist between these two men themselves, right? Um, in the name of love. It's a bit like the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna saying that I love Arjuna more than my wives. It's a bit like that. So it's that kind of love, right? So homosociality. Now, the reason I mention this is that if you're talking about mainstream films, there are several mainstream films in India and even elsewhere in the world that can be viewed in this way. This normally usually pertains to men. It's rare to come by the reverse sort of situation where there are two women in love with the same man and then they decide between themselves um, who is going to have him without consulting him. It's almost impossible to think of a situation like that, you know, which also brings to bear on this whole illustration the idea of a patriarchal culture, right? Because this exists. This is that's why her book is called Between Men, not Between Women. So this happens between men, you know, who, as it is, have greater agency than women on account of patriarchy, and then this is how they use that agency. You know, in a popular film, the idea that the movie is putting across to the audience is this: that sacrifice is superior, sacrifice is selfless, right? And sexual love is selfish. So, but that is too simple. This is what Sedgwick is really, um, you know, dismantling this idea of sacrifice and valor versus selfish sexual love. But mostly, a movie like that would, you know, would want to give off that sort of message that sacrifice is superior to sexual love because sexual love is rooted in selfishness, sacrifice is rooted in selflessness. But that's too simple. And one has to sort of deconstruct the equation that exists between these two men, right? Who are giving the impression that they are doing it in the name of sacrifice, but actually it could be something else. So all this, you know, becomes the apparatus of queer studies when you're looking at a text. And when I say text, I mean a literary text or a film or a play. So it is with this apparatus that you reread a text, even a text that is not really meant to be um, a gay text per se. Take Foster's novel Passage to India. The whole relationship between Dr. Aziz and Fielding can very profitably be looked at if you have these theories at your disposal. Now, E.M. Foster was homosexual, but in his time, he didn't dare to write a homosexual novel till the very end of his career when he wrote Maurice. But certainly in Passage to India, if you read it as a mainstream reader, you would see the friendship of Dr. Aziz and Fielding as friendship. But let's not forget, have you read Passage to India? Let's not forget that Fielding goes out of his way to defend Aziz against the accusations of Adela Quested, who is a Britisher like himself. So he's not taking the side of the Britisher, which would be more usual for a man in his situation to do in colonial India, but he's taking the side of this Indian doctor and defending the Indian doctor against the insinuations of the British woman. And I think that the Sedgwick theory can apply very profitably to a text like that. Okay?
Yes, yeah, Raj. In fact, I don't know if the film is uh, very faithful to the text, but then film actually throws certain hints at the possibility of some homoerotic sort
Yeah,
of
the David Lean film, I know.
revelation. Yeah,
Especially that scene when Fielding is having a bath and Aziz
exactly,
was.
exactly, exactly. Yes, yes, yes. Right.
Okay, my battery is low now, so I'll have to log off. Um,
Yes.
Anything that you guys want, you can always call me.
Right. So, Raj, let me take this opportunity again to thank you for a wonderful and engaging session on queer theory, literature, and cinema. I'm so sure that there will be many more questions, and people would definitely get back to you. Either they can write to you, they can like interact with you on your Facebook. Uh, page as well. So this is quite open. And I would like to assure all the participants that very soon we would be also releasing the summary of these sessions along with the list of books that have been constantly referred to during these sessions so that you can also benefit from these summaries in future. So Dr. R.
You're
Raj Rao.
you're putting it on YouTube, the whole recording.
Yes, these will be available on YouTube, but we have to edit these videos and make them into smaller units so that people are able to sort of
Okay.
access these. Yeah. So
Okay.
this will take quite some time, but we'll definitely do that. So
Okay.
thank you,
Fine.
Raj. Thank you very much.